Titans on the beat.
What's good, everyone? It's your boy Nati with another video for the channel. Welcome back to DMV Sports Zone, and today we got another great video. I'm going to be continuing my preview series of each weekly matchup for our Washington football team. And as I said before, I am of course a diehard Washington football fan, but I will try to give you guys some objective analysis on the upcoming game to be played on Sunday, and I'll continue to do that throughout the season. So with that being said, let's get started with the preview for the Washington football team versus Arizona Cardinals game on Sunday. So first and foremost, I'll start with the notable injuries per the injury report that was released earlier today. Kendall Fuller is questionable with a knee injury he sustained a couple of weeks ago, but for the first time in a long time, he was actually a full participant in Wednesday's practice. So he looks to be a full go come Sunday, and this is probably the biggest news across the injury report for both teams because he is Washington's cornerback one at this point, and Washington did sign him to a 4-year, $40 million contract this offseason, so they're expecting a lot of production out of him, and he looks to be full go come Sunday. And then you got Thomas Davis, who's questionable with a calf injury as well, but he too was actually a full participant in practice on Wednesday, so he also looks to be a full go. He might not start right away. He might be a backup piece for the defense, but when you got a wily veteran like that who has a ton of leadership to his name, you know, we saw that in Carolina, but also with a young Chargers defense last year, he played pretty well, had over 100 tackles. It's always good to have that type of player in the defensive coordinator's brain, defensive coordinator's thinking, so then like he could use him at any point during the game. So that's great news for sure. And then Cole Holcomb, meanwhile, is questionable with a knee injury he sustained in the first half of last week's game against the Philadelphia Eagles, and he was actually limited in practice Wednesday, so there is some caution around him being available on Sunday, but hopefully he is, man. He is a key part on that defense. He's super fast. He's one of the few linebackers on this team that could cover Kyler Murray, but also could cover the fast, shifty running backs that Arizona has. So that's a big deal right there, and we'll see if he's ready come Sunday. But no one else really was on the injury report. Sadik Charles, Antonio Ganey-Golden, who all had stints on the injury report, were not there. So that's great news, and I don't remember the last time the Washington football team has been this healthy. Washington Redskins have been this healthy at week 2 in an NFL season. I don't remember. We always have a lot of injuries, so this is definitely great news and a step forward in what should be a pretty solid team this year. And then with Arizona, Josh Jones, the offensive tackle out of Houston that was drafted in the 3rd round this year, is questionable for Sunday's game with an ankle injury, and from reports he was also limited in practice on Wednesday, so that might be a key loss, or maybe he might find a way to play on Sunday, who knows, but that is definitely a big deal for Arizona. Mason Cole, their starting center, has a hamstring injury and is another questionable player for Sunday's game, and he did not practice on Wednesday at all, and the chance that he's available for Sunday is very much in question right now, and that's your starting center, right? And you also have a tackle out, so that offensive line is looking kind of shaky right now. Linebacker Kyle Pitts did not practice on Wednesday and might not play on Sunday because of a wrist injury. That's another problem for Arizona there. Tight end Max Williams also did not practice on Wednesday due to an ankle injury, and his availability for Sunday is also in question at this point, and I don't think he was the starting tight end or got a lot of the reps as a starting tight end, but that's still a big deal, right? When you have a rotation of tight ends that need to be on the field to block, to pass, and he's a key part of that offense. So that's sort of a big deal there. Maybe not as much of a big deal as your starting center being out, but still news at that point. Jalen Thompson, though, one of Arizona's starting safeties, is questionable for Sunday's game against Washington with an ankle injury, and that's an even bigger deal, right? That you're talking about one of your starting safeties, one of the key parts of your secondary that will be tasked to slow Washington's underrated, in my opinion, still receiving core down with Terry McLaurin, Steven Sims, Antonio Ganey-Golden if he plays, Antrell Inman. So that's gonna be tough for Arizona if they don't have that safety, but I think they should still be okay. They still got Patrick Peterson in that secondary. They still have Budda Baker, so we'll see how things pan out on Sunday. Arizona, though, as a whole, does appear to be more banged up than Washington, which is crazy to say because we're always injured, especially along their offensive line, which is sort of what we saw with Philadelphia last week and might give us a chance, might give Washington a chance to sort of pounce on that line early in the game or even throughout the game. Who knows? And then some other logistics about the game. It will be shown on Fox at 4:05 Eastern time, and 4:05 is a change from the usual for Washington football fans. Usually all of our games are at 1 p.m. and for me it's a unfavorable change, but we have to make do with it, especially because they're playing in Arizona Pacific time, so that makes sense. And it will technically be played at Arizona's home stadium in Glendale, Arizona, but of course, no real home field advantage will be had because there's no fans in the stadium, much like there were no fans in Washington this past week. And the odds makers now have Philly as a 6.5 point favorite over Washington, much like they did last week with Philadelphia. But I don't know about that, and I think the game will be much closer than that, as I will discuss further in the video. And now with the mini week 1 recap for both teams as part of the Last We Saw Them segment that I'll have every single week in these game previews. Washington is still riding high off their epic comeback win on Sunday, where they were down 17 points and pretty much scored 27 unanswered points to win 27-17 against the Philadelphia Eagles. And while the Eagles did have an injury-riddled offensive line last week, no one outside of this channel and the DMV sports community thought that Washington had a legit chance of winning the game on the backs of their super talented defensive line. I think many of us fans thought that, and many of the local analysts even thought that, but not many of the national media folks thought that, and we won, right? And the defensive line feasted all game. They racked up 8 sacks and garnered an NFC Defensive Player of the Year, and the legend Ryan Kerrigan, who had 2 sacks and broke the all-time franchise record that was 91 sacks by Dexter Manley, broke it and now has 92 sacks. So that was an amazing performance on Sunday. Top of defensive line, Washington secondary, while starting off slow in the first half, did bounce back in the second half with Fabian Moreau and Jimmy Moreland, People's Corner, both corralling 2 great game-saving interceptions off Carson Wentz. And the offense, meanwhile, also started off slow, but did get better as the game got along. Dwayne Haskins, while not putting up the most eye-popping of numbers, I think he only had 178 yards on the day, he did go 10 for 14 on his passes towards the second half of the game and didn't make the dumb mistakes that Wentz made throughout the game, so he gave us a chance. He really did. And the running game, though, couldn't really get going throughout much of the game. The yards per carry for each one of our running backs wasn't very high. I think Antonio Gibson had the highest at like 4 yards per carry, and he only had 36 yards in the game, so he wasn't really great, but they all showed flashes, and Peyton Marbury even found his way into the end zone twice, so that's great news there. Hopefully they improve this upcoming week and as the season goes along, with Antonio Gibson being that RB1 of the future for us. And Washington pretty much had a 2018 type performance, right? With game managing type of offense, right? With Dwayne Haskins not being asked to do too much, putting up only 178 yards, but not making any dumb mistakes, right? He did miss a couple guys down the field, but he didn't throw any interceptions, which is always key. No fumbles that were recovered by Philly. Like that's key right there. And the defense is pretty much what carried us to the win. And that's again what happened in 2018, and that was very successful for us. We went 6-3 before Alex Smith went down using that play style, but it'll be interesting if we could carry that into next week with Arizona, who presents a much healthier and much tougher threat for us, and ultimately would give us an even better game than Philly gave us last week. And then with Arizona, like Washington, Arizona's also coming off of a great win on Sunday against the reigning NFC champion San Francisco 49ers. And Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray, who I predicted in the offseason and still think so now, could possibly be the real life MVP and fantasy football MVP come the end of the season this year. I really believed in him throughout the offseason, and the fact that Arizona supplied him with a lot of weapons, it's all there for him, right? All there for him for the taking. And he didn't put up the most amazing of passing stats last week. I think he only had like 230 yards, a passing touchdown, and a rushing touchdown, but he did do a lot of work on the ground, and he got nearly 100 yards, right? Based off of his scrambling. I don't think there were too many design runs, but that's what happens when you lose contain on that defense. So Washington, beware of Kyler Murray and his running ability. The Cardinals rushing attack otherwise wasn't exceptional. Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds didn't have the most phenomenal of games, but they were solid. They both had a touchdown each, right, to their names, so they weren't too bad, but it is what it is. On Sunday, though, it was really the Cardinals' star wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, who we all know they got in the offseason through an inexplicable trade from the Texans. Bill O'Brien, what are you doing? David Johnson is legit, I'll give you that, but like DeAndre Hopkins is a top 3 receiver in the league. Like, what are you doing? And he doesn't have as bloated of a contract that David Johnson has. So anyways, that's another story for another day. DeAndre Hopkins had a big game last week. He had 14 catches for 151 yards in his first game, in his debut game for the Cardinals. And I think things are only looking up for him. And Washington has a tough task on their hand. Maybe not containing him all the way, but slowing him down. That's going to be a tough task for any defense, including Washington. And then when you turn over to Arizona's defense, they played fairly well the entire game and did a really good job of limiting the 49ers rushing attack and also passing attack as well. All-pro defensive end Chandler Jones even got a sack for good measure, and he was great as usual. And it's definitely someone Washington should look out for this week, with a very talented defensive end that they really need to contain in order to win, in my opinion. So the Cardinals have all the tools to be a really great team this year, and it'll be interesting to see if they continue their winning ways into Washington or into Arizona, but against Washington this week. And maybe this is the start of a epic season for them. Maybe this is a bumpy road in their path. Who knows? We'll see come Sunday. And now into, as you guys know from last week's video, some key position battles that everybody should look out for between the Arizona Cardinals and the Washington football team. So the first position battle is the Washington's defensive line versus Arizona's offensive line. So as many of us know, Washington fields one of the most talented defensive lines in the NFL with 5 first rounders, count it, 5 first rounders, and a stud by the name of Matt Ioannidis making up the group. And we saw all that talent together for the first time last week, right? When Chase Young had a sack and a half in his debut. Ryan Kerrigan had 2 sacks, even though he only had 22 snaps on defense. I mean, it seemed like everybody got a sack, right? Even John Bostic got a sack last week. So that defensive line is super talented, and they did feast against the Eagles' talented, albeit injured offensive line. Meanwhile, Arizona's coming to week 2 with an even worse offensive line, in my opinion, than Phillies. And the Cardinals also have injuries. So, I mean, that's a pretty tasty matchup if I were on the Washington defensive line and if I were Jack Del Rio scheming up some sacks to get out of that offensive line this week. It's going to be tough for Arizona to stop our D-line. Ultimately, I don't think this matchup bodes well for Arizona against Washington's fierce defensive line. It will be interesting to see how this matchup plays out on Sunday. And then with Arizona's wide receivers versus Washington's secondary, Arizona, of course, features a stacked wide receiver core with DeAndre Hopkins at the top, but also studs in Christian Kirk and Larry Legend or Larry Fitzgerald also being thrown into the mix. Also saw that Hopkins particularly did last week what we all saw he did in Houston too many times against a tough 49ers defense, catching, like I said earlier, 14 balls for 151 yards, playing against a great cornerback in Richard Sherman most of the game. So he did all that work against a talented cornerback in this league that has been a stud in this league for a long time. So Washington secondary, meanwhile, did play well in the second half of the Philly game last week and is getting a big boost and arguably their best cornerback coming back in Kendall Fuller, who they signed to a contract this offseason, as I mentioned earlier, and he's coming back from injury. But even with Fuller's return, though, as primarily the slot cornerback, with no legit cornerback one to match up with Hopkins on the outside, Hopkins should feast in this matchup. I'm sorry to say this to Washington football fans, but I think he's in for another big game this week. I really do. And that might be the deciding factor on whether Arizona wins or not. But yeah, it's not looking great for Washington's secondary. And I think the bigger question, though, will be if the rest of Arizona's receiving core steps up, because they didn't really do that last week. And will Washington's secondary also be much improved than what we saw from the first half of last week? Or will it revert back to the first half and be giving up a lot of big plays and have a lot of miscues on defense? Who knows? But that's why this Sunday matchup is so interesting for sure. And then Arizona's running backs versus Washington's linebackers. The Cardinals running backs weren't phenomenal last week, as I mentioned earlier, but both Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds did have solid games and do share great potential in that Arizona backfield, especially in a Cliff Kingsbury spread offense that they're pretty much having there in Arizona for the last 2 years, actually. Meanwhile, Washington's linebacker unit does possess talent and upside in the guys that we have. Kevin Pierre-Louis is someone who a lot of people predicted to have a breakout year this year. Cole Holcomb, if he plays, is a speedy linebacker. And you also have guys like John Bostic and Thomas Davis probably coming back this week as well. But even with Thomas Davis being thrown into the mix, the linebacker core is still not very fast. Doesn't very much have the speed that you need to contain guys like Kenyon Drake, Chase Edmonds, and a guy that I'll mention right after this. So it's going to be a tough matchup for Washington, and I don't really think it bodes well for Washington. I think they'll struggle in that department, and I think Arizona's running backs, while not having the most phenomenal games, I think that core will be very good this week and will have an even better performance than they did last week. And then lastly, Kyler Murray versus Washington's defense as a whole. It's going to be a full-on task by the entire unit to contain him. Kyler Murray is legit, guys. As he's been saying for a long time now, he's almost a carbon copy of a young Russell Wilson at this point. Maybe even better than a young Russell Wilson because of the fact that Russell Wilson had that defense in Seattle to sort of lead him to a lot of wins, and Kyler Murray doesn't do that, doesn't have that, and he's a really legit talent, really legit player at this point. It'll take a huge collective effort by Washington to limit Murray on Sunday, and that starts first and foremost with the defensive line and putting the pressure that they put on Carson Wentz last week and not really allowing him to escape from the pocket, which they did a really good job of last week. And then even beyond that, the linebackers need to do a really good job of limiting Murray, and once he gets to the second level, if he does get to the second level, doing a good job of containing him, and whether it be on scrambles or also on design runs, they really need to step up next week more so than they did last week. And even the secondary, right? If Murray is somehow, some way limited on the ground, the secondary needs to do a good job of limiting him through the air and not giving up the big plays and not letting him, pass for 50 yards on the field on a 4th and 17 or a 3rd and 17, right? Like, they need to limit him through the air, and it's going to be a full-on effort once again by the entire defense to limit this guy because he is likely going to be a candidate for MVP this year, if not next. And now, the moment that you guys have all been waiting for, my game prediction. Ultimately, I believe Washington's defensive line will feast against Arizona's not so great offensive line right now, and I think Ryan Kerrigan and or rookie stud Chase Young, the 2nd overall pick in this year's draft, should be in for big games as they were in last week. I also think DeAndre Hopkins will get his against his Washington secondary that might be improved from last year, but we're just throwing Kendall Fuller into the mix. He's just returning back from the injury he sustained a couple of weeks ago. So I think it might be a slow start for that secondary this week. And I think DeAndre Hopkins will really get his once again, right, in 2 consecutive weeks. Arizona Cardinals running backs should be better than they were against the 49ers, but I don't believe we'll get a standout performance from them. And I think Washington will do a relatively good job of limiting them to much output on the ground and even when it comes to pass catching out of the backfield. I also think the biggest difference between the 49ers game last week for Arizona and the game this week is that Washington actually has a healthy group of underrated, albeit electric receiving threats, whether it be Antonio Gibson, Terry McLaurin, or Steven Sims. And we saw last week the San Francisco 49ers went down with several injuries to their talented skill group. I don't even think they had Deebo Samuel. George Kittle went down in the game, and it was tough for San Francisco to sort of throw the ball down the field. And I think it might not be the easiest for Washington to do that this week, but I think they do have weapons that they'll sort of factor into the game plan more than they did last week against Philly. And after all that, though, I do think Kyler Murray's escapability may be too much. The caveat, however, being that Jack Del Rio he is a great defensive coordinator, and maybe could probably scheme up a defense that could limit Murray on the ground and force him to throw the ball through the air. And we do have some talented cornerbacks, albeit unproven in the case of Fabian Moreau, Jimmy Moreland, and others. So maybe Jack Del Rio could be the defensive MVP in this game just based on how he schemes up the defense. But it's going to be a tough task by that unit, and a very tough task, especially coming in week 2, right? 2 weeks into the season, they're going to be playing Kyler Murray, and will probably be a prep course for Lamar Jackson, who will actually be played a couple of weeks later with that game against the Ravens. So either way, though, I think this will be another super close game that can go either way. I know there are analysts out there who think the Cardinals will win by 30 points, win by 20 points, just in a full blowout, right? I don't believe that. I think it will be a super close game like it was last week. But right now, sorry to say this, Washington football fans, but I think Arizona barely squeaks out with a W come Sunday. I just think it's a lot to slow down on that offense, and their defensive line at least isn't the best in the league, but it's still pretty solid. And you also have to factor in Chandler Jones. It's gonna be a tough week. But again, I'll add the caveat that if Jack Del Rio some way somehow schemes up a defense that limits Kyler Murray, I think Washington has a very good chance of slowing that Arizona offense down and ultimately coming out on top in Sunday's game. So again, super tight game. I would probably go with the score of 27-24 right now for Arizona, but I could just as easily see Washington coming out the game with that score being on top. I, of course, would be much happier as a Washington football fan if that were to be the case, right? If Washington were to come out on top, but this pretty much just sums up my objective analysis, and I try to be honest with you guys, try to be truthful, and try to give you guys everything you need in this preview without sort of having a bias one way or the other. Having said all that, that's the end of this video, guys. It's a great preview this week. I appreciate all of you guys who watch it, as I do always. You guys are the best. You guys are awesome for supporting this channel, for liking it every video, for commenting, for subscribing. I really appreciate that, and thank you guys so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. We greatly appreciate it as we try to post fire content as much as possible on this channel. We also have a Twitter page at DMV Sports Zone and an Instagram page, all lowercase DMV Sports Zone. We try to post fire content on there as well. So make sure to follow us on all our platforms, and thank you guys so much again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. It's gonna be a fun game on Sunday though. Peace out.